Welcome back to our channel, where every story has a hidden lesson. Today's story is about an old man who attended every funeral in his town, even when he didn't know the person who died. But why did he keep doing it? Stay with us until the end, because the reason behind his strange habit may change the way you see goodbye. His name was Thomas Carter, and he was 78 years old. For nearly 12 years, people in the small town of Millbrook had noticed the same strange habit. Whenever someone died, Thomas would appear at the funeral. He never stood with the family. He never approached the coffin. He never offered condolences. He simply stood somewhere at the back, usually beneath a tree or beside an old stone wall, wearing the same dark coat and holding a small worn envelope in his hands. He would remain there until the funeral ended, then quietly disappear. At first, people assumed he was a distant relative, but after years of seeing him at funerals, they began to realize something strange. Thomas didn't seem to know most of the people who had died. He came to the funerals of shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, strangers, and even people who had moved into town only a few months earlier. Nobody understood it. Some people thought he was lonely. Others whispered that he had lost his mind. But Thomas never explained himself. Then, one cold afternoon in November, a 26-year-old man named Daniel noticed him standing at another funeral. Daniel had seen Thomas many times before, but that day something felt different. Thomas was staring at the coffin with tears in his eyes. When everyone began leaving, Daniel stayed behind. He watched Thomas turn away from the cemetery and slowly walk toward the road. Finally, Daniel gathered his courage and followed him. After a few minutes, he caught up with the old man. "Sir," Daniel said, breathing heavily, "can I ask you something?" Thomas stopped, but didn't turn around. Daniel continued, "Why do you come to all these funerals? You don't even know these people." For several seconds, there was complete silence. Thomas slowly turned around and looked at Daniel. His eyes were tired, but there was something peaceful in them. He reached inside his coat, touched the old envelope he always carried, and quietly said, "You're right, I don't know them." Daniel frowned. "Then why are you here?" Thomas looked toward the cemetery behind them. "Because every person in that cemetery reminds me of someone I once knew very well." Daniel waited for him to explain, but Thomas simply walked away. And for the first time, Daniel realized that the old man's story was much bigger than he had imagined. The following morning, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. There was something in the old man's voice that made the question impossible to forget. So Daniel returned to the cemetery and found Thomas sitting alone on a bench near the oldest part of the graveyard. This time, Daniel didn't ask another question. He simply sat beside him. After a few minutes, Thomas looked at him and said, "You really want to know, don't you?" Daniel nodded. Thomas opened the worn envelope he had carried for years. Inside was a small photograph, faded with age. It showed a young woman standing beside a man in a military uniform. They were both smiling. "Her name was Anna," Thomas said. "She was the person I loved more than anyone in this world." Daniel looked at the photograph and asked, "What happened to her?" Thomas took a long breath. "I lost her a long time ago." He explained that he and Anna had grown up in the same town. They had been best friends since childhood, and eventually they fell in love. They planned to marry, build a family, and grow old together. But when Thomas was 22, he received a letter ordering him to leave for military service. Before he left, Anna gave him the photograph and made him promise one thing: "Come back to me." Thomas promised. He believed he would, but life had other plans. During his service, Thomas was seriously injured and spent months recovering far from home. When he finally returned, Anna was gone. Her family had moved away, and nobody knew where she had gone. Thomas searched for her for years, but every trail ended nowhere. He never married. He never stopped looking. Then, decades later, he discovered something that changed everything. Anna had died many years earlier. She had spent the final years of her life in another town, living quietly and raising a son. Thomas never knew she had a child. He also discovered that Anna had asked her son to bury her beside her parents. Thomas found the grave, but by the time he arrived, The funeral was already over. He stood there alone, holding the same photograph Anna had given him when they were young. "I was too late," he whispered. Daniel looked at him sadly. "But what does that have to do with all these funerals?" Thomas stared at the photograph. "Everything," he said. "After Anna died, I realized something. People don't always get the chance to say goodbye. Sometimes life separates us before we can tell someone how much they meant to us." He paused, then looked toward the cemetery. "So I made myself a promise. Whenever someone in this town dies alone, whenever their family is far away, whenever there is nobody standing beside them, I will be there." Daniel finally understood. Thomas wasn't attending the funerals because he knew the dead. He was attending because he knew what it felt like when nobody came. From that day on, Daniel began visiting Thomas regularly. He learned that the old man had kept a notebook for more than 10 years. Inside were the names of every person whose funeral he had attended. Beside each name, Thomas had written a few words about them: what they had done for a living, who they had loved, what kind of person they had been, and sometimes a small detail he had learned from their obituary or from someone in town. "Why do you write all this down?" Daniel asked one evening. Thomas smiled. "Because I don't want them to disappear completely." Daniel began helping him. Together, they visited elderly people who lived alone. They brought groceries to those who needed help. They listened to stories from people who had nobody else to talk to. Slowly, the strange old man everyone had once whispered about became someone the whole town respected. Years passed, and Thomas grew weaker. One winter morning, Daniel received a phone call telling him that Thomas had died peacefully in his sleep. Daniel immediately went to the cemetery. But when he arrived, something unexpected happened. The cemetery was filled with people: shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, young people, elderly couples, and families from all over town had come to say goodbye. Daniel stood beside Thomas's coffin, holding the old photograph of Anna in his hands. Then he noticed something on top of the coffin: the worn envelope Thomas had carried to every funeral. Inside was the photograph and a short handwritten note. Daniel unfolded it and read the words Thomas had written years earlier. "If you are reading this, then I have finally gone to meet the people I spent my life saying goodbye to. Don't be sad for me. I was lucky. I loved someone deeply. I lost her, and somehow that loss taught me how important it is to show up for others. If there is one thing I want you to remember, it is this: never wait for a funeral to tell someone they mattered." Daniel could barely hold back his tears. He looked around at the people who had come to say goodbye to Thomas and finally understood the greatest lesson of all. For 12 years, people had wondered why an old stranger kept attending funerals. They thought he was strange. They thought he was lonely. They never realized that every funeral was his way of keeping a promise to the woman he had loved. Thomas had lost Anna once because life had separated them before he could say goodbye. He spent the rest of his life making sure that other people would not have to feel completely alone at the end. And from that day forward, whenever someone in Millbrook died without family nearby, Daniel was there. He stood quietly at the back of the cemetery, just as Thomas had done. Because sometimes the greatest way to honor someone isn't to know their whole story. Sometimes it's simply to show up.